In part two, we're going to be seeing a lot more of Jessie and her shelter, more of Juan Pablo and hearing his internal process. I'm also going to be talking about this idea of alone as a starving contest and being realistic about calories. Also, really important is to talk about why getting food on alone is different and more challenging than you might think. I have people comment all the time on my videos saying, I don't understand what the problem is. That's a river that people go to fish all the time. It's an easy river to get fish on. Not applicable to the alone experience, and we're going to be talking about why. Huge fan of the song that Jessie is singing by the river, how she knows there's so many fish in that river and it's so hard to get them. Of everyone out there this season, it really seems that Jessie is struggling the hardest with the food situation. And she knows it. She talks about it. She says, man, I have put so much more time into the shelter than I thought I would. I'm burning up so much energy on it. I really need to start focusing on food. That is one of the reasons why her little song she sings feels so important. She is having a harder time, and she is really buoying her spirits with song and play and finding reasons to bring the joy out. And I think this is really, really key. So I love her creativity, and I love the ways that throughout her footage, we're seeing those little techniques to really bring herself back to center and remind herself that she wants to be out there, even though it's challenging. Even as we see her singing, we can see the creases in her cheeks and really see just how much weight she has lost so quickly. So, it's hard to see, and I really want to see Jessie get some food. So I really hope that she finishes Hodgepodge quickly and can focus on bringing in the food that she clearly really, really needs. She's getting close now on her shelter, and I love seeing her technique for getting her walls built rather than stacking them like a log cabin. She is looking around and she is seeing what she has to work with, and that is a lot of dead, downed debris. And so she has this rack system and she's piling the debris in there. I think it's a great idea. It is also very labor intensive, and that is heavy stuff. And I don't think it's a great idea given the situation she's in now, because it's just such a big cabin. I think if she was planning to be there for a long time, it's a great way to get big, massive walls that are going to give a lot of insulation and as well as thermal mass. But given her situation now and the fact that it is day 30 and she still only has one wall done, it's just too much. You can just see the effort every time we have footage of her moving stuff and working on that shelter. She's like, and hefting up these big things. That is so many calories to burn. Juan Pablo's pot full of fish gelatin looks awesome. He's so right that that stuff is just gold. So that gelatin means that there's a ton of collagen in there, and that is so good for your system, so nourishing for your whole digestive tract, which is important because it's really hard on your digestive tract out there. So those berries, so a lot of vitamins and fiber and that good collagen, and probably very rich with those fish heads in it, looks awesome. And it looks like there's 10, 11, 12 fish heads in there. So it's clear that he's been doing pretty well with the fish, more than we saw him catch on the last episode. So really good to see him eating really well. Really identify with his philosophy out there. Don't screw up. That is his mantra. Don't screw up. And I think that that is a really important thing. You know, we've been talking about humility and mental attitude, and I think a lot of people go in with this idea that they're going to vanquish and they're going to do this or that. But the reality is just carrying on is enough because what takes a lot of people out is some way that they've actually screwed up. So for example, Benji getting the parasites and getting sick, Igor choosing a shelter that was just too hard on his body with the amount of calories he's bringing in. So totally agree with Juan Pablo that a really important mantra is don't screw up. And again, it's one that also brings in a lot of humility and recognizing that you're fallible and just having a mind to making really wise choices out there, because starving will take a long time to take you out, but one really bad screw up can take you out in a heartbeat. Man, really nice fly rod that Juan Pablo has made. You can see how flexible it is, which is also, I'm sure, why it ended up getting a crack in it. But he fixed it really well, a nice tight lashing with paracord. And then, man, his fly rod just looks awesome. And he's very lucky to have enough shoreline that he can get really good casts. We'll be contrasting that with when we see Jessie later on and the shore she has to work with. Really difficult spot to cast from. We can also see that Juan Pablo has made a nice bench, and he clearly has a piece of dimensional lumber. So that is a sign that there are people on this river, and probably docks or that kind of thing, or maybe way upstream there's places built on the river or with docks, and so some of that flotsam has come downstream. But what a resource, right? Dimensional lumber out there, really nice to have that to work with. Then we see Juan Pablo get a shot at a grouse in a tree and decide not to take that shot, just like Teimojin said, I'm not going to be taking these high shots. He chooses not to take that, and he waits until that grouse is on the ground, and he gets a good shot off, and we can hear the grouse flapping, and he clearly hit it. Was really curious at first what kind of arrow he used, because clearly that arrow went all the way through the grouse. But backing up and looking at it again, I could see that he did in fact use a blunt. So rather than a broadhead or a field point or something that was sharp and go right through it, he used a blunt, which ideally would have just stunned it. But it might have been because the bird was backed by the ground that it went right through, and then in its flapping, it kind of flapped itself off of that arrow. But we see him find it, and we see that arrow covered in blood, so he knows it was a good shot and a mortal wound. And then he has to deal with the fact that he does not know where that grouse went. And Juan Pablo, I am so with you, because that is exactly what happened with my grouse on season 6, where I know it was a good shot, I get the arrow afterwards, and it is covered in blood and feathers, and the grouse is just gone, gone, gone. Now, here is one of those things that it's hard to know what really happened. My inclination is to say he did not spend long enough looking for that grouse. He knows he hit it. He knows it is probably dead. And we see him walking around a bit, and my heart goes out to him, because that terrain looks really, really hard to walk through and really hard to find a grouse. But it looks like he didn't spend that long looking for it. I spent hours looking for my grouse when I got it, and I did eventually get it. So my looking paid off. That said, we also don't know how long he actually spent, because we're seeing a highly edited version. He might have spent 3 hours looking for it before sitting on the shore and talking about it. He might have spent 15 minutes. We don't know. So my inclination is that he should have spent longer looking for it to be sure to retrieve it, but also maybe he did, and it just wasn't worth the calories that he was wasting looking through that really intense terrain. And so he let it go after putting in a good effort. So we'll never know how long he spent looking for it until he comes on my Patreon call in August. So some people will know and be able to ask him. Very curious to hear that answer. And speaking of grouse, going back to Teimojin, and dang, look at him nailing those grouse. 3 grouse in one day, which is awesome. Also want to point out that spruce grouse have very different looks in the 2 different sexes, and we have seen mostly the male spruce grouse, I feel like, in this season, and we see a really good shot of the spruce grouse's head where it's really dark. The male spruce grouse are mostly darker and the females are lighter, and then the male have that very distinct red spot on the head, which we can see really well here. So this is a point that I want to talk about, because Teimojin gets those 3 grouse, which is awesome, and then he says, that's 3 weeks worth of food. Oh my gosh, it is not 3 weeks worth of food. That's really, really inaccurate. We saw in some of the earlier episodes them saying how many calories in the little alone subtitles, how many calories are in a trout and how many calories are in a snowshoe hare. And I believe it was around 800 for both of them. Grouse are smaller than snowshoe hare, and they don't have a lot more fat. So there are probably less calories in a grouse than a snowshoe hare. 3 grouse really would not quite meet his caloric needs for 1 day, not 3 weeks worth. So this is where I was talking in the part 1, where Tom talked about getting a beaver, saying that's about 5 days food. I think that's accurate, because beaver are so rich and so fatty and way bigger, versus Teimojin saying 3 grouse is 3 weeks worth of food, right? This shows you how starvation can affect the brain and make you less realistic about your actual caloric needs. He could stretch that out over 3 weeks, and it looks like he's planning to, because he breaks it down and he smokes that grouse. We're going to talk more about this when we see him actually building the smoker and processing those grouse. Jessie wakes up on day 31 to fresh snow. So it is time to get serious about that shelter. Day 31, and she still doesn't have her finished shelter. And for sure, nothing is going to light a fire under you like snowfall when you don't have adequate shelter. So she is really putting in every effort to finish her shelter, and I love how she's making that nice roof, doing the bark shingling. She's laying out branches first to support the bark, and then the bark shingling, and then the boughs, and then moss on top of that. It's great, but it's a huge amount of effort. So it's a good idea because those tarps are clearly so flimsy and fragile that lots of padding is going to be great. It's going to give insulation to our shelter, but dang, so much time and effort. And you can, I feel like, see her body wasting from the effort and just how many calories she's burning to do this. If Jessie didn't have a tarp, then it would make sense to put all that effort in with the bark shingling and the boughs, but she has a tarp. So while it's good for insulation, it's probably way more effort than she needs to be putting in. We then see her working on her fire pit. Great idea to have an air vent like that. That's awesome. It's going to make a big difference. Not sure why she's got punky wood down beneath her rocks on the bottom. To me, what that's going to do is just catch the coals and smolder and put a ton of smoke out into her shelter. So if she has a chimney, then maybe it's a technique to keep coals for longer, but otherwise I'm not really sure about the punk wood. I would love to hear about that in our call with Jessie as well. We also see her talking about her weight and the fact that she is down 30 pounds already, 30 pounds on day 30. So a pound a day she's losing, which is okay because she put 30 pounds on in order to go. But right now she is at her normal weight. And if she keeps dropping at that rate, it's just a matter of time before that becomes really problematic. And I'm so with her because my first weight check on season 6 was day 21. And I was down 21 pounds, the exact same, 1 pound a day. But luckily, that's when my snaring started coming in. And so I was starting to eat a little bit more. So my weight loss slowed after that. There's all of these kind of peaks and troughs in terms of weight loss on alone, depending on your activity and the temperature and what you're bringing in. And it's just really interesting to note how it isn't necessarily a steady decline. It shifts over time. As always, please remember to subscribe to my channel, like the video, and hit the little notifications bell, and check out my Patreon membership. We've still got, I think, 5 season 9 participants coming on our Q&A calls live for my Patreon members. Great shot of Terry just standing there appreciating Labrador. He talks about how he's been so busy preserving that beaver meat that he hasn't had as much time as he wants to just observe it and enjoy and appreciate it. This is one of those moments that just really captures so much of the alone experience. And Adam talked about it. A lot of folks have talked about it, what it is to just feel that every day out there is a gift and be there for the experience. We haven't heard Terry talking about how much he wants to win and how he's going to do it. We hear him talking about, this is what I love doing and this is where I want to be right now. I love it here. And an attitude of gratitude is everything. Absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful to hear, Terry. Fabulous modeling and so sweet to hear you talking about your mama and honoring her and naming a spot after her. I love it. There was a plant growing on the shores of Kuneve, where I was in the Arctic, that was called Sweet Gale, and Gale is my mother's middle name. So I was really aware of my mom out there and also had something in the landscape to bring me into that appreciation of her. So love you anchoring the mama appreciation. So now we see Teimojin making a new shelter to process his game near the beach, where if a bear was to come, it would be a good place to shoot it. I think that's a really great idea, to have a place set aside for your game processing so that you are not drawing the predators into your shelter where they can be a problem for you. That said, definitely do not agree with his choice in smoking those grouse. If you think about the amount of time and effort he is putting in to process those grouse and save that meat, he's burning a lot of the calories he would get from those. And given that each grouse is just a fraction of what he needs for a day out there, I think a much better call would be to start with the organs of the grouse and eat all of the organs, and then 1 grouse a day minimum that would be 4 days of eating. And then there's no need to preserve them, because in 3 days at those temperatures, those grouse aren't going to be going bad. And then he would have saved himself all of that effort and all of those calories that he spent in building a new shelter, cutting up all of that grouse and sitting there and smoking it. Also, we see him cleaning his grouse by the river. And I've talked about this with other folks. It's a thing, it's an understanding that you clean your animal and then you rinse it. But to my mind, you never should be doing that unless the shot got the stomach or the intestines, and so you actually have digestive juices in the bird itself. But if you process an animal really well and are careful not to bust the stomach or the intestines, you can clean it so well that it's going to be cleaner just as is than if you dunk it in river water, which likely has giardia and other parasites in it. Plus, you are losing some of the blood and some of the important nutrients by rinsing it in the river. So just clean things really well and don't rinse them and eat all of that blood rather than letting it wash away. So Teimojin's attitude about taking that little bit of food and spreading it out is something that is a common thing on Alone, and it is something that we have seen before. This happened with Dave Nisha in season 3 in Patagonia, where he was catching fish and drying them and saving them for later, but absolutely emaciated with starvation. So it is not a good strategy to have food that you could eat right now and save it for later, because the chances are that, one, you're going to get so weak that you're going to be less able to get food later, and two, your digestive system can shut down so that you're not able to digest that food well, and you're not going to get as much value out of it later as you would right now eating it before you let your system shut down. So always better to eat the food at the rate at which you need it when you have it, and then store it as fat or as muscles that you don't have to break down quite as early for later. And that way you're going to be feeling better. You're going to be having more energy, more capable of bringing in more food, right? So a beaver, big enough that sure, it makes sense to put the time in to save it. Grouse, small enough and lean enough that I don't think there's much point, not with only 3 of them. Teimojin says, today I'm just going to eat the scraps and the skin and 2 hearts, and that'll be today's ration. That is like 100 to 200 calories. That is so little food. So really want to see Teimojin just dive in and cook and eat those birds rather than preserve them. Now we go back to Jessie on moving day, seeing her take down her tarp and finally put that on Hodgepodge Lodge. Oh, does my heart so much good to see her finally moving into that shelter that she has spent so much time and energy on. Still, man, it's not finished. One of the walls is still totally open and it is snowing. So again, that shelter was just so enormous. Got a picture of Jessie as she's getting started on the walls in relation to her shelter that can really show you the scale of it and how oversized it is for that environment. So Jessie is feeling it. She's having a hard time. She's in a pissy mood. She's really hungry. She really wanted that food. And I get it. It's so hard to see her struggling, but stay devoted to that shelter that's just draining her so hard. She always brings it back. She always has a good attitude and finds something to celebrate and small successes to give her that feeling that she's doing well out there. And that's really, really important. But oof, crossing my fingers that she starts bringing in the food soon. We then see her at her fishing spot and she's got a pole, but she talks about how it's hard to cast. And you can see that that shoreline is really narrow and it's really steep. So she has just a little bit of shoreline, it looks like. And yeah, she doesn't have room behind her to cast. So clearly a much more challenging location for Jessie than a lot of the people have, particularly for fishing. And we can see in a lot of the footage of her moving materials around, it looks like she is basically just backed up against the bank. Really challenging terrain. Every time we see her footage, that seems really, really clear. And again, that's one of those things that the show doesn't really emphasize. It is just not equal, and some people have much more challenging sites than others. So that combined with her choice to build that big shelter, just, oh, it's making her really struggle. Our final scene is back to Juan Pablo, and he's talking about having dealt with isolation a lot in his life because most of his family and friends are way far away in Mexico, right? He lives in northern Canada and most of the people he knows and loves are in Mexico. So it makes perfect sense that he is someone who has a lot of practice at dealing with isolation. And this is the episode that we see people not just dealing with isolation, but missing their loved ones. And this is such a sweet and touching scene, him talking about his girlfriend, Jennifer, and how much she means to him and how important she is in his life. And you can just really hear it and feel it as he's talking about it, right? And I think this is a really lovely illustration of the degree to which sometimes having someone else that we devote our experience to can be a huge motivator, right? So Juan Pablo has talked a lot about how important it is for him to win, but he's talking about it for someone else and for the money and for not having to struggle anymore. And this is a common theme we see in people on Alone, but him particularly linking that to someone he loves that it would make a big difference for. And we've seen Adam do that on this episode. We've heard Terry talk a lot about his mother and just how your emotions work out there and how important those relationships with the important people in your life feel when you're dealing with such dramatic isolation. And how important experiences like this are to make us really appreciate what we have. Like it's hard to do in our busy lives with all of the normal stressors. So I love this scene and how it shows the emotional evolution that it is to be out there. It also is really poignant with his remorse about that weasel. He's out there, he clearly needs food. He shot an animal, but he feels so bad about it. He wasn't really, it seems like he was trying to scare it off and really wasn't necessarily trying to shoot it, but it was a great shot. And in fact, he did shoot it. And that feels harder to him than the joy of the food value that he's going to be getting from it. So this kind of shows how heightened emotions can be when we're out in isolation and undernourished for so long. So I want to go ahead and talk about that undernourishment, because even though we are seeing people get so much more food this season than we have across the board in other seasons, everyone is still really struggling. So I want to talk about the idea that Alone is nothing but a starvation contest. And I feel like anyone who has made those comments, and I have gotten some of those comments on my YouTube channel, isn't really watching season 9, because these people are doing so well with game. They are such talented hunters. There are so many really talented fisher people out there. We are seeing a lot of food come in. So I definitely disagree that it is a starvation contest alone. There's a lot of skill being displayed. Now, this has shifted in recent seasons. I would agree that for the early seasons of Alone, it really was more of a starvation contest. People were bringing some food in, but by and large, it was almost always the biggest person who brought the most calories in on their frame who won the earlier seasons. But that hasn't been true the recent seasons, and this season is showing such a high skill level. That said, starvation is definitely still a big part of it. So it's not just that, but even when you're bringing in food out there, a cold environment where you have to do everything yourself and you are handicapped by not having the kinds of hunting, trapping, fishing equipment you would normally have, it's still very, very hard to bring in your calories. And that is on purpose, right? They are not putting people out in the summertime when the living is easy. They are putting them out at the crux of fall and winter. And all the game gets harder to get at that point. Well, I shouldn't say all. Some things are in the rut right then and easier to get, but many of the things out there become harder and harder to get. Things are tucking up for winter. Fish are going into deeper waters. There's less and less fish out there. So no matter how good you're doing at bringing in game, you are not set up for success. You are not set up to not be experiencing starvation out there. Even the people bringing in the most food are in ketosis. They're living with less fat than their body really wants, with no carbohydrates, mostly with less plant food because they're launched after plant food. So very little fiber, very little vitamins. It is hard. It is hard on the system. I've also had a lot of people make comments like, what, they can't get enough fish? That's an amazing fishing river. It's ridiculous that they can't get enough fish. I feel like that shows a lot of ignorance about what the Alone experience really is. Because yeah, there's a beautiful fishing lodge that they launched from. It is a renowned fishing location, but those are people who are coming with modern gear, with all of the supplies that they need, fishing from boats or from the shore in the places that are the best fishing locations and have the ability to get up and move if they're on a spot that has bad fish. So going in the fall, when the fish are going to deep waters without poles, I think they were maybe allowed one fly, but the rest of the flies they have to make themselves, and underfed, no shelter, no warm place to go home to, no warm, dry change of clothes when they're done being on the river for a while, unable to move to a different location if they have a crappy location. There are just so many factors, and that's not even to mention hauling those big cameras around and having to film everything, which is a huge handicap and takes a huge amount of time and energy. So you just can't compare gathering food under normal circumstances to the alone experience. There's so much more going on. And then, of course, we're also seeing the highly edited versions. So we don't know about all of the time and energy people might have put in making more flies, making poles, trying lots of different fishing locations that didn't work, all of the different strategies they have. By and large, if they didn't actually get something with that strategy, the show usually doesn't put it in because it's not as interesting TV, right? You want to have that sequence of the beginning and then the middle and maybe some struggle and then persevering. That's what makes it interesting. So if that isn't what happened, you're probably not seeing it. So my job in these reviews is to give you, the viewer, a little bit more perspective on what the alone experience really is and why it is so much more challenging than you feel like it would be sitting at home, well-fed, full brain capacity, and not having to worry about everything made yourself with insufficient gear. So in conclusion, is alone nothing but a starving contest? No, and there are always elements of starving contest in there. You're always going to be hungry and uncomfortable, and even the most successful people out there have still dropped a lot of weight.